Out of each of the Silent Hill games that I've covered so far, the third entry in the series is probably the one I knew the least about. Apart from a handful of story details, I didn't know much about this game at all, which wasn't the case for Silent Hill 1 and 2. I've been watching and experiencing those games for years in one form or another, so when it came to Silent Hill 3 and going through it blindly for the first time, it was a very different kind of playthrough. For me, horror games are at their best when they are entirely unexpected. Obviously, if the game has been spoiled, then it's not going to hit anywhere near as hard. But I'm also talking about the game itself being unexpected. Horror games should be nearly impossible to accurately predict, bizarre in the things they make you do, and elicit a series of reactions that end up making the game an unforgettable experience. And to me, Silent Hill 3 manages to tick each of those boxes. However, there are also a lot of rougher edges that stick out like a sore thumb. Silent Hill 3 had an interesting journey behind the scenes. Team Silent were fresh off the heels of Silent Hill 2, which didn't perform very well sales-wise in Japan, which is curious because it seemed to do pretty well internationally, selling over 1 million copies in its first month. I'm not really sure why that's considered poor, but sales figures are an enigma, and they make no sense anyway, so who cares really. The point is, Silent Hill 2 didn't really impress Konami all that much. So much so that the original plan was to make Silent Hill 3 a rail shooter.
I'm fully aware of what I'm doing. Can't you see?
Now, I love rail shooters, but if there was a horror game series that did not suit this idea, it was Silent Hill. Luckily, Team Silent had managed to overturn this plan and stuck to making a regular Silent Hill game instead. Masahiro Ito, the art director for the original Silent Hill games, sometimes talks about these behind-the-scenes events on his Twitter page. It's thanks to him that we know a little more about the development process behind these games, so please follow him if you're at all curious about the Silent Hill series. The bottom line of all this is that Silent Hill 3 suffered from budget problems and time constraints, which was largely due to its prior existence as a rail shooter, which ate up a lot of resources. The game manages to disguise a lot of these issues by shaking up some elements of the series formula. That and a tasteful bit of asset reuse make Silent Hill 3 a shockingly good entry into the series, even if everything was going against it. Silent Hill 3 plays extremely similarly to both of the prior entries. We've got tank controls, a camera system that can't decide if it wants to be fixed or not, and extremely light survival horror mechanics that do the job. It doesn't break the mold that the series has established thus far, and to be honest, it didn't really need to. The tank controls in particular feel excellent. Whenever you simply walk into a room, the deliberate and slow motions of the character manage to immerse you even more into these environments. And that's something that only tank controls can really offer. While yes, tank controls are not as responsive as a standard 3D control scheme, they do give you a much finer degree of control to navigate these types of areas. Tank controls are a bit like bowling balls, and this is an analogy that works, trust me. Some games with tank controls feel like you're fighting with the controller. Silent Hill 1 is a culprit in this case. It can often feel like you've just rolled a lopsided bowling ball and the character is slowly trailing off in different directions. Now, great tank controls feel like a bowling ball that's perfectly round. Once thrown, it glides right towards that strike. Perfect bowling balls don't necessarily go straight 100% of the time either, but they always meet their mark and glide over to the place they need to be. Silent Hill 3 is a case of the latter, where the movement just feels about perfect to me. You can be fast, but be able to turn at the right amount of speed to get around corners and enemies really easily. It's really hard to explain through a video, but the movement just feels right. Combat is mostly the same as before. You ready with one of the triggers and attack with one of the face buttons. You can still move while shooting, and that's something I love since it allows you to gain some distance while attacking. There's also the amazing addition of a block button, something that the previous two games didn't have, and I didn't really notice its absence there. But when I go back, it's definitely going to annoy me. Blocking allows melee to actually be viable for most boss fights, and it still requires some skill to use as it only protects you for a certain amount of time. And while we're on that topic, boss fights are actually pretty interesting to talk about this time around as well. Before, you simply shot the boss until it was dead. You rarely had to deal with any sort of special mechanic. But now, we have bosses that can actually block attacks. One fight forces you to try and get around to the back of the boss, since it can block most attacks from the front. Are these fights dense with mechanical complexity and a range of possible options? Hell no. But they add just enough to these encounters to make them feel like more than just walking sandbags. The minute-to-minute gameplay here is still fantastic and largely unchanged from the prior games. You navigate through a range of different areas and locations while solving puzzles and clues to the wider storyline throughout. The starting location in the mall is a breath of fresh air for the series. It has wide open areas and more claustrophobic places too. The variety in this location alone is kind of crazy, and the most impressive part to me is that these locations are huge. The amount of time it takes to properly explore and discover the areas in this game is a lot in comparison to the older titles. Some of these levels are kind of rough though. The subway tunnels in particular are something that I found to be really annoying. The layout is confusing and the signage doesn't really help you figure out where to go. Plus, it introduces something that I actually really don't like about Silent Hill 3, and that's insta-kill death traps. This game is littered with insta-kills that can set you back a fair way if you haven't saved in a while. There are also outright bizarre design decisions regarding them too. For example, in the subway, if you jump onto the tracks, a train will run you over. Not really a surprise, but this teaches you to not go onto the tracks. That's all well and good, but the problem is that in order to progress, you have to get on the tracks to try and open a door. And this one specific time, you're able to get back onto the platform in time. Stuff like this just feels really annoying and nonsensical because the game teaches you something and then wants you to do that exact thing to progress. Luckily, most of the areas in this game aren't too bad regarding that, but one criticism with the general level design I have is that some of these areas are just too big for their own good. The best example of this is the underpass, which has these really long corridors that on a first playthrough, you'll likely walk down many times in order to get the necessary items to progress. It just takes a while and feels a bit tedious, unfortunately. But on a more positive note, improvements to the general gameplay can be seen in various places. Your inventory now has 3 different item categories to help sort things out. You've got items, which usually houses objects needed for puzzles, as well as things related to the story that can give you some more context on certain things. Then we have weapons, which is fairly obvious, and then there's supplies, which holds your health items and ammo. This new menu is fantastic, and it makes navigating through all of your items so much easier. The game mixes things up with the weapon selection this time around too, albeit not too much. In both Silent Hill 1 and 2, you would eventually get a pistol, shotgun, and hunting rifle, along with a handful of melee weapons. Silent Hill 3 decides to ditch the hunting rifle in favor of the submachine gun, and it's fine. I kinda missed the hunting rifle, to be honest. The satisfaction of taking down most enemies in a couple of shots felt pretty good. You do get a katana pretty early on though, and that's very cool. On the topic of weapons and items, Silent Hill 3 fixes a particular issue that I had with the last 2 games. These are supposed to be survival horror titles, and with the amount of supplies that Harry and James had at their disposal, you wouldn't really know it. Silent Hill 3 significantly reduces the amount of health items and ammo you can find. There's still plenty to be found, but just enough to make you rethink about engaging every monster you see. It also encourages you to make use of melee weapons even more, even though melee combat still feels a bit awkward. Some things aren't so different. The way the map works is largely unchanged. Notes are made on the map as you progress that tell you whether a door is inaccessible or locked, which passageways are dead ends, and so on. I personally was very happy to see that save points finally get marked on the map, and since there are those insta-kill spots we mentioned before, this is very nice to see. Now, let's get into where Silent Hill 3 had its issues in development, starting with the fact that the area of Silent Hill you visit is entirely ripped from Silent Hill 2. It's just the western Southvale section of the map that houses Heaven's Light and Brookhaven Hospital. And when we get into the story later on, you'll see why it would make more sense if we explored the areas from the first game instead. I don't necessarily dislike the reuse of these areas though. In fact, it's actually really cool to be walking down the same roads that James did in Silent Hill 2. It's so nice to be able to feel that history as the player. Being able to go to Heaven's Light especially is also so cool. You can even find a poster mentioning the return of Lady Maria, along with a leaflet that James could find in the Woodside apartments. And lastly, we need to briefly touch on the presentation. While it's mostly the same sort of style as Silent Hill 2, there are a lot of improvements. The main character's model in particular is much more detailed and less weird looking in general. James's face in Silent Hill 2 looked a bit awkward, to be honest. The environments are also way more detailed. Things like the storeroom in the mall have have so many cool little touches, and it does a lot to make these areas feel more immersive. But beyond the things I just mentioned, Silent Hill 3 doesn't do too much to break the mold established with the first two games. This isn't a bad thing. In fact, the little additions and tweaks make the moment-to-moment gameplay feel much more enjoyable. I found myself fighting with the controls less, boss fights felt more engaging, and the core of Silent Hill's gameplay was largely left intact. Now let's get into the scary shit. We can't really talk about a Silent Hill game without talking about the horror aspect. For Silent Hill 1 and 2, I spent a lot of time talking about the tone and atmosphere they establish. Those games are mastercrafts in selling a distinct setting that feels claustrophobic and horrifying. And I would say that the biggest strength this series has when it comes to horror is the way it uses locations that are very familiar to us. Whether that comes in the form of an elementary school, a hospital, an apartment building, or a hotel, these are the kinds of places that most of us have been to at one point or another. And that small connection we have to those places makes these locations feel so much more immersive than they would otherwise. The soundscape can often be overwhelming, the environments are grotesque and unsettling, and the little details throughout are crazy. I was actually kind of shocked at how much this game got to me at certain points. Each little moment feels perfectly placed to make you feel that tiny bit more paranoid, which manages to sink you further and further down into the game's dark atmosphere. Let's take a look at the starting location in the game, the mall, which starts off seeming fairly normal. Almost as soon as you walk through a couple of doors, the entire atmosphere changes. Then we enter this corridor when we can hear a conversation coming from the nearby room. The muffled voices start to make you ask questions. Where is everyone? What are they saying? Where are the voices coming from? And since one of the key things about malls is that they're typically loud and busy, this tiny section feels so wrong. And the best part is that this has no resolution. This game doesn't even tell you where the voices really came from or who they belong to. Moments like this, where the game lets the player take a second to think about what's going on, are littered throughout Silent Hill 3. And the fact that it's able to stop you in your tracks like that is incredible. It's also where the true horror comes into play. Silent Hill 3 is very carefully balanced to make you feel a particular way. It balances the visuals, audio, and gameplay perfectly to get you paranoid enough to make any sound and visual cue get a reaction out of you. It's always difficult to explain why horror is effective because it comes down to your personal relationship with what's happening on screen. I personally don't find grotesque creatures or spooky castles scary at all, and that wasn't a dig at Resident Evil, that game's great. But settings that hit close to home, places that feel like real places, do get to me. A familiar sound like someone walking down a set of stairs is terrifying when you're supposed to be alone. Again, it's the connections that we have to places like this that make the horror so much more effective. It makes it so much easier to imagine that it could happen to you or me at any time. I need to applaud the fact that none of these games have ever really relied on jump scares to fuel their scariest moments. In fact, most of the really tense moments in these games are built up to in a very slow way. Jump scares have their place, but they can hold a horror game back from being truly terrifying. Horror that actually fucks with you and plays on your paranoia and imagination. That's the stuff that sticks with you. Horror needs to make you think about what's going on a deep level. It needs to give you pieces to a puzzle without really ever giving you the solution. This is something that Silent Hill has always done really well, and even when the series does lean into the tropes of horror like with jump scares, they feel earned. Ultimately, the most important thing a horror game needs is balance, and that's something that Silent Hill 3 does perfectly. More so than Silent Hill 1 or 2, to be honest. Each location has so much personality and its own unique atmosphere. The subway is, again, a location that we usually associate with loudness and huge crowds of people, but the opposite is once again true. We've also never seen a location like this in the series before. It's genuinely very eerie, to the point where you may want there to be some monsters to show up just to break the silence. Another area I love is the Hilltop Center, a building with a variety of offices for various companies that you pass through at one point. This is a fairly normal location, but again, it's one that you wouldn't normally associate with this sort of atmosphere. And when it transitions to the other world, it adopts an entirely different kind of ambience. Brookhaven Hospital also makes its return, like I mentioned earlier, and it's very cool to be able to explore it again. This time around, there are new rooms to discover, and it's also where the game decides to kick it up a notch with the horror. Throughout the level, you can find notebooks written from a Stanley Coleman. In these notes, Stanley professes his insane, crazy love, and notes how he's watching you in the hospital. We never actually see Stanley, which makes these notes even creepier. Silent Hill 3 also brings back the lakeside amusement park from the first game, but the area I actually want to talk about here is the Haunted Mansion. Now, I don't think there's anything that makes me more likely to shit myself than the idea of a haunted mansion in Silent Hill, and this is perhaps the most unnerving area of the entire game. First off, a disembodied voice is constantly speaking to you, telling various creepy stories. His voice manages to have such an unsettling tone in its delivery. Then there's the fact that you're trapped in here and are forced to go through the area at its pace instead of your own. And finally, the area tricks you into thinking you found the way out before forcing you to run down a series of corridors with insta-kill death traps. There are tons of other smaller moments too, and things you can stumble on that are entirely optional. I don't want to spoil everything in case someone else sees this and decides that they want to go and play it themselves. I'll just say that Silent Hill 3 manages to ace almost every aspect of horror. It's less of a psychological slow burn like Silent Hill 2 was, and more like the first game in its execution of a lot of things. Alright, we are moving on to talk about the story now, so skip on over to this timestamp if you don't want to be spoiled. And okay, let's talk about it. So Silent Hill 3 decides to bring the focus back to the cult shenanigans of the Order. If you are a fan of Silent Hill 2's more vague and psychological aspects, then you won't really find that here. This is a very straightforward storyline, which has its good and bad points. On the plus side, it's a lot easier to break down in a simple and concise way. It's also easy for anyone to understand on a first playthrough. However, it's a lot less interesting to discuss since it's such an open and shut story. That isn't to say I don't like it, since I quite like the cult angle, it just feels a lot less unique as a whole. Perhaps the biggest change in this story is the fact that we're playing as a very different kind of character. Heather, the protagonist, is a seemingly normal 17-year-old girl who even manages to crack a few jokes throughout the game.
Forget it. This is way too gross. Who would even think of doing something so disgusting?
And she reacts a lot more like a human being would in these kinds of situations. She also has plenty to say when interacting with different parts of the environment, which is nice to see after previous characters had pretty generic responses to most things. It's just nice to see frequent glimpses of her personality shine through some of the darkest moments in the game. But I'm gonna be really honest here, the supporting cast is honestly a lot less interesting than we've had before. Again, if you liked how the cast of Silent Hill 2 were there to support the themes of the game and each had their own unique backstory, you'll be disappointed. We've got Douglas, a detective that ends up helping Heather out after instigating the entire plot of the game. Then we have Vincent, a member of the cult that doesn't seem to be a massive fan of their current plans. And finally, there's Claudia, who is the main antagonist of the game and the current head of the cult. That's about it for characters, and most of them aren't too interesting, unfortunately. Heather absolutely carries the game, as her arc is the most interesting by far. Douglas is a pretty bland character that doesn't have too much going on, plus his voice acting is kind of shit.
Sorry.
Vincent's entire gimmick is that he's crazy, but not crazy enough to be a completely bad guy. Claudia gets a fair amount of depth towards the end of the game, but her story revolves around wanting to summon God, and that's about it. Now, I know that I'm not making this sound too great, but the story here is a lot simpler than we've had before, and since Silent Hill 2 went to such a unique place, it just feels a bit disappointing to see Team Silent retread the same ground from Silent Hill 1. But it does get somewhat of a free pass, since it's a direct sequel to the first game story, and this isn't something that was widely discussed as the game was released. It takes a while for that to be established in the game itself as well. For the first third of Silent Hill 3, Heather seems to be just a regular teenager that needs to escape a world full of monsters and horror. The opening mall section plays out exactly like this. Heather spends the day at the mall, but thanks to Claudia, she gets stuck in a dark and twisted version of the area. Heather's only goal right now is finding the way back to the real world. Then, when she does escape the area, we get the idea that something much bigger is going on. But before anything else happens, we have a few more big gameplay sections before anything is revealed. After navigating through the subway, the underpass, and the Hilltop Center, Heather eventually runs into Vincent, who reveals that Heather's father is Harry. As in Harry Mason, the protagonist from Silent Hill 1. And it isn't hard to figure out then that Heather is the baby that Harry was given at the end of that game. It also makes the inclusion of the cult make a little more sense, and this results in a storyline that goes to some pretty dark places regarding Heather and the things that the cult want from her. It isn't long before Heather returns home, where she can hopefully ask Harry for some advice. But, plot twist, Harry's been murdered, which genuinely makes me feel a little sad. Surprise, surprise, Claudia was the one behind it, so Heather obviously wants some revenge. The problem is that the rage Heather is feeling right now is exactly what the cult wants. Claudia then runs off to Silent Hill with Heather planning on chasing her. But remember, this is all Douglas's fault since he's the one who found Heather to begin with. So, fuck Douglas. He does help Heather put Harry in his bedroom and give her a free ride to Silent Hill, which is nice, but still, fuck Douglas. What follows from all this is perhaps my favorite scene in the whole game, and maybe even my favorite scene from all three of these games. Heather begins to explain who she is to Douglas, as well as the significance of Silent Hill. She starts remembering what happened to her in Silent Hill 17 years ago, where Dahlia and the cult tried to summon God, and how Harry Mason was able to put a stop to it. Heather then recalls how Alessa had given Harry a baby, and then confirms that the baby was in fact her. Heather is the piece that Alessa had taken from herself once again and gave to Harry so that she could hopefully live a peaceful life. When the two get to Silent Hill, they have to track down someone named Leonard, who Douglas got told about from Vincent, and I'm not really sure why you would trust him at all. Still, this is the only real lead they have. They also get told to check out Brookhaven Hospital, so the two decide to split up. Heather checks out the hospital, and Douglas goes to Leonard's house. Nothing too interesting goes down at the hospital, but we do manage to get in contact with Leonard, who reveals that he's Claudia's father. He disagrees with what she's doing, though, and wants to put a stop to it. However, as I'm sure no one is surprised about, he ends up being a pretty bad guy. In fact, he's even more ultra-religious than anyone else we've met, so of course, we need to put him down.
Shame.
Killing him gives us the Seal of Metatron, which is apparently what we need to kill God eventually, and upon leaving the hospital, we see Claudia and Vincent arguing about their ultimate goals. Claudia wants to do the whole paradise thing, but Vincent would rather the world stay as it is. When Heather gets back to the motel, Claudia's gone, but Vincent remains to tell Heather where to go next. The next stop is the church, accessible through the Lakeside Amusement Park. There's a bunch of weird, spooky stuff going on here, as well as a location that's reminiscent of the first game's rendition of this area. You can actually find a memo written by Harry Mason in this area, and if you remember back in the first game, you would save by interacting with memos. It's insanely cool that we get to read this, as it gives us even more insight into how Harry was feeling during that game. Douglas somehow finds his way here as well eventually. I don't know what the hell happened to Leonard's house, I don't know. But he runs into Claudia, and it seems like he's about to shoot her, but the screen then fades to black. It doesn't take long to find Douglas, and he's somehow managed to break his leg. Well, anyway, he's out of the game for now, and it's up to Heather to go deeper into the park to find the church. And after fighting a mirror version of herself that shares the same black hair as Alessa, Heather manages to find the chapel. Heather bumps into Claudia once again, and seemingly has all the memories back from when she and Alessa grew up together, which is why she doesn't shoot her here immediately, I guess. Heather even straight up tells Claudia that she is Alessa, but I'm not sure whether Heather's just trying to trick her here or not. I really don't know why she doesn't just shoot her. And just so we're all on the same page, I am very quickly going to cover what the cult wants from Heather particularly. See, back when Alessa was around all those years ago, the cult used her to eventually birth a god. A plan that did work in Silent Hill 1. The problem was that Harry killed the god and ran off with the reincarnation of Alessa. But thanks to Douglas, again, fuck Douglas,
What did I do?
they were able to find Heather, the reincarnation of Alessa. They want Heather to do the same thing, give birth to God and unleash a new paradise onto the world. That's the gist. It's a pretty fucked up story about cultist shit. Case closed. Heather obviously doesn't want any of that, so her plan is to kill God off with the Seal of Metatron. Vincent also wants to help Heather because he doesn't want to see this happen either. But he's also pretty crazy himself. However, he does mention something pretty interesting.
You're the worst person in this room. You come here and enjoy spilling their blood. and listening to them cry out. You feel excited when you step on them and snuff out their lives.
Are you talking about the monsters?
Monsters? They look like monsters to you?
Which is in all honesty there to fuck with Heather, and I doubt that she really has been going around killing people the entire game. But it's an interesting idea. Like, what if the inhabitants of Silent Hill really did turn into these strange and mutated creatures? They must have gone somewhere. After Alessa... Sorry. I actually got it confused. Oh, okay. After Heather explores the church and uncovers many of its secrets, she finds herself back in Alessa's bedroom, the exact same room from the end of Silent Hill 1. It's here that you can find the last memo from Harry just before he faced the incubus. It's a simple message, but one that perfectly exemplified what his character was all about. He was a father that just wanted his child to be safe, and whether that meant Alessa, Cheryl, or Heather, he didn't care. With that final message in her head, Heather goes on to face Claudia one last time. A small scuffle happens between her and Vincent first though, which ends with Claudia stabbing him in the back. Heather collapses, and it looks like God is ready to, pee her. But she stands up and delivers this incredible line.
Shut your stinking mouth, bitch!
We're then thrown back into gameplay where we can actually start talking about endings. The instinct of most people here is absolutely going to be just to stab Claudia in her little dumb face. However, that isn't the actual solution. Instead, we need to open up Heather's necklace and use the red ball inside it. And if you remember back in Silent Hill 1, this is actually a Glophodus. And by using this, you can kill the god inside Heather and, well, throw it up as a weird fetus. The ending of this game is very weird, and it does get weirder. Claudia's having none of this, so she decides to do the reasonable thing and eat the fetus, in the hopes that she can birth God instead. And that's not how any of that is supposed to work. And then she gets pulled down a hole by Voltiel, who we haven't actually talked about yet. He's this game's Pyramid Head, but he's barely in it, and it gets confusing at that point, so I kind of blank it out. But anyway, down this hole is where the final battle awaits. Hilariously, all that's left of Claudia is her dress, and Heather is clearly annoyed as she wanted to kill her herself. She had plenty of chances though, so whose fault is it really? We then see God, which looks more like a fucked up mannequin made of whale bones, and after a very annoying battle, Heather defeats it and is finally free of the cult. This moment of rest finally gives her the space to properly try to process Harry's death, and she collapses out of pure grief, which is genuinely very sad. But she does get up and tries to sneakily stab Douglas. This of course is a joke, but not if you get the bad ending where she really does stab him to death. And then the game ends pretty happily. Yep, that's it. The ending here is a lot more straightforward in comparison to the first game's 4 endings and the second 6 endings, but there you go. It almost feels kind of rushed in comparison to Silent Hill 2. I do like the story in this game, I just don't really find it that interesting to talk about because there really isn't too much going on here besides the cult and the rebirth of God, and yeah, I don't know. It's not really for me, I guess, but I didn't mind it. It's all right. Alright, to wrap things up, I want to go into a couple things that we couldn't really get into before. The first thing I want to talk about is unlockables, and there isn't too much to mention here. Again, we have the classic UFO ending, and once again, it is incredible. There are also 12 different outfits in the game that are pretty much all different variants of a vest and jeans. One of these outfits does transform Heather into a superhero called Princess Heart, with a weapon called the sexy beam, though. The PS2 version of the game has a total of 26 outfits, but the extras are just to represent different game journalism outlets like IGN, so if you want to rep those colors, I guess you can. There's also a flamethrower you can unlock, but that's kind of lame. It's nowhere near as cool as a lightsaber? You can also meet a sewer fairy that will give you a silver or gold pipe, which is weird. And I just want to take a quick minute to talk about the soundtrack, and Akira Yamaoka has once again done a stellar job. Silent Hill 3's soundtrack has a punk rock edge to many of its songs, which helps it stand out more from the first two games, while still having that distinct Silent Hill sound. The more atmospheric tracks are also incredible and manage to make certain areas feel so much spookier. My favorite song in the game is definitely the one used in the opening section. End of Small Sanctuary just brings such a welcoming warmth to the start of the game. It expresses the sort of freedom that Heather has as a youth, but then its darker edge creates a foreboding sense of tension. It's such a shame that it only plays for about 30 seconds before we're thrown right into the spookier side of the game. The darker tracks also manage to increase the tension in certain areas. The church has many tracks that play that simply serve to stress you out. However, in comparison to Silent Hill 2, I don't think this game's soundtrack manages to quite beat it. The music in that game just manages to fit everything so perfectly, to the point where it feels unfair to compare other games to it. Still, the music here is exceptional and does a lot of the heavy lifting for making areas feel spooky. And you may have noticed that I'm playing this game via the PC version, though I do not recommend that you do the same. I encountered so many bugs and issues and crashes, as well as a glitch that made it so ammo pickups didn't appear in my inventory towards the latter half of the game, so I just had to rock with melee weapons the entire time. If you can manage it, stick with the PS2 version. But to wrap it up, Silent Hill 3 is another brilliant entry into the series that further refines the kind of horror that Team Silent had done such a great job with. Is it a perfect game? No. No, it isn't. The corners that had to be cut due to budget and time constraints really show in the game's second half, and I think it hurts the game quite a bit. The pacing is all over the place for one thing, with some areas feeling like they last too long. Level design also takes a hit as they feel a lot less tight than they did in 1 and 2. The horror is still incredible though, with such an amazing attention to sound design and the placing of scares. So, while I definitely do have my complaints with Silent Hill 3, I'm still very impressed with what it accomplishes. Right now, I'm not sure if it dethroned Silent Hill 2 as my favorite game in the series, but it did cut it really damn close at one point, and it probably would have if not for the issues I encountered while playing the game myself. This is a game that you should not miss out on if you haven't given it a shot yet. My advice would be to obviously play Silent Hill 1 first, otherwise you just aren't going to get most of the references and why certain things are so cool. It's also a brilliant way to properly close out the story from that game. All in all, Silent Hill 3 did really impress me, even though it had its issues, and it feels bittersweet to come to the end of Team Silent's final normal Silent Hill game. But all things must come to an end, and boy, am I glad that I went through it.